Good afternoon and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 42, The Art of Preparation, Mise en Place, and Embroidery. Hello everybody, welcome to the Takeup. It is 2:30 p.m. Mountain Time. We're right thereafter here in the wonderful and brilliant studios in Albuquerque, New Mexico, as you know, where I usually come to you from. And I am here again today, here to talk about preparation, to talk about a term that I'm going to overuse and probably use incorrectly called mise en place. And we're going to talk about preparation in various ways. We're going to talk about preparation in embroidery digitizing. I know a lot of folks, I do the digitizing at the end and the business on the front end. We're going to try and flip that for you folks who want to do art and embroidery first and then get to the business and planning at the end. We'll flip it a little bit today and talk a little bit about art and embroidery first this time around. However, we're going to talk all about preparation and why it's important and discuss the concept to some degree of mise en place. But what I am going to do is first call out, everybody's been talking about the fact that it is Friday the 13th. And what I'm going to say is no unlucky day is as tremendously bad for you unless you are not prepared. Preparation makes us able to handle things that are outside of our control. And so it is fantastic to get some preparation in. Also, it is episode 42. And with episode 42 comes one other thing that I can't help but bring out, and that is the fact that 42 is the answer to the universe, the life, the universe, and everything, the question of what it is. If you know Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, then you know what I'm talking about. All the rest of my fellow nerds know that 42 is the answer to the question. We just don't know what the question of the life, universe, and everything is. However, it reminded me that in episode 42, I want to do something special. So here is your brief interlude of something something you have to enjoy. Don't panic, folks. This is the answer. So anyway, if you guys know Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I think you might like that. Don't panic. It's another good thing. Yeah, have your towel. Mike Muldowney coming in for you. If you don't know Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe, you might not love that. But yeah, don't panic, folks. Everything's going to be fine. In any case, and I love this. Okay, Marion says, translated mise en place to Amazon Plus. Not really. We'll translate mise en place shortly. But before we get into it and talk about preparation and talk about some other topics like working clean, which is part of mise en place, I'll talk about that. We'll talk a little bit about ergonomics and workflow and things like that. But we'll also talk a little bit about making decisions and being prepared. Honestly, I will be fully honest with you guys and caught to the fact that I am not always the most prepared person. Sometimes I like to work, fly by the seat of my pants. However, what I'm going to say is that when I have gotten into a state of flow and gotten a ton of work done, a lot of that has to do with the fact that I was prepared enough or that I did manage mise en place, did what I call foundational work. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Some of the foundational work we do so that we're not making decisions on the fly all the time and so that we are making good decisions and so that we are able to be more creative. Because a lot of people say or feel like you can't be creative, can't be artistic if you aren't kind of flying by the seat of your pants. The truth of the matter is doing preparation and foundational work doesn't mean you're less creative. It means that you have a base that you're starting from. And when we're talking about business, people say, okay, well, getting too hidebound or working too much on preparation might mean that you're not able to pivot, which I would say it's more that you now have a foundation on which you can work and pivot. And we'll talk about this again later, but I'm going to go ahead and start with this phrase. It's a lot easier to fight fires if you already went and bought a fire extinguisher. So when things come by that we can't control, it's a lot easier to handle those if we have the tools we need to handle them. So let's go ahead and start really quickly with saying hi to everybody who jumped in, because I always like to say hi to you guys. We have Jeff Fuller in. Hello, look forward to the discussion. Jeff Fuller of MNerd. If you haven't checked out what he was doing, did a video yesterday, I believe, on working designs into caps, something I might talk about a little bit too, also cap designs and sequencing, stuff like that. Really cool. Justin says, happy Friday the 13th. Happy Friday the 13th to you, Justin, also a digitizer himself. And I am actually a fan of Friday the 13th and of unlucky numbers and things like that, because what I think it is a state of change, and change is where all the good stuff is going to come from. Worst reason to do anything is because it's always been done that way. Traditional alone won't keep us going, especially we don't know what it is we're doing or why we're doing it. I like to know a little bit more of the why. Josta saying, hi from Sweden. Hi, man. Glad to have you here. Gina Butler saying, hi, guys. Hi, Gina. Happy to have you in. Mike, already called you out, but happy to have you here, Mike. Jeff, 3:30 Central Time. Apparently, Central Time, center of the universe. If you ask anybody who's in the Central Time Zone, it's good for you guys. Frank says, good evening, all. Woohoo, it's Friday. For all of us who are entrepreneurs like Frank yourself, you know Friday doesn't mean as much as it could for someone who's working a 9 to 5, but happy to have you guys in here. Tom Farr, Buzzards Bay Embroidery, by the way, referred some people to Tom recently. He's got some great videos out there showing technique and does consulting himself. Great digitizing and embroidery guy there, Tom. Like I said, Mike has his towel. He's ready. So we know what's going on. Christine says, good afternoon, Eric. Hope you had a nice Friday the 13th, and I know where my towel is. See, all of my people who've read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy are in with me. Also, that little scene that I showed you, which I'll show you again later on in the show, that comes from the original BBC version of that show, and I couldn't help but digitize that just to show you guys don't panic. I'll replay the design later for fun. We'll talk about sequencing, and I'll play that design out if you want. Sonia Stiles says, hi, everyone. Well, hi, and I love the thread spool emoji. Good going. Love that. John says, yay, Takeup. Now I know it's Friday. After doing tons of hats, I may take a break and enjoy Eric. I don't know if I'm break worthy, but I understand wanting a break after doing tons of hats for sure. And John says, having the tool when needed is a great point. And here's the thing about Mise en Place, which we'll talk about shortly. Just letting you know, it's not just about having the tool. It's having the tool when you need it, where you need it. And that's where it gets into workflow and everything else. And I know that's not always everybody's favorite thing to talk about, but I'm serious when I say that if you get your workflow and your production right, everything else will hang off of it. If you get your preparation right, everything else hangs off of that. So like I said, it's one of those topics where I know that this is not the big stunner for viewers like 3D foam or like working on gradients. The creative topics always bring people out. What I'm going to say is the people who listen to this topic are more likely to be able to do more consistent work faster and get more done. And honestly, I think do more creative work in the long term than people who don't do any preparation at all, or who don't think about preparation or don't think about things like art preparation, which we're certainly going to get into. But let's go ahead and start talking about it. Like I said, I don't know if this will be a super long bonus time show, but I think that there are some things here that are valuable, and I am going to try and take this into some different places, into digitizing, into embroidery, into production, into business planning a little bit, into the general sense of what it means to do foundational work and planning and making decisions. So hopefully we'll get something that's interesting to everybody. But let's go ahead and start with the term itself. Where did I get this from? Mise en place. Now, I may be saying this incorrectly. I do not speak French, and that's probably very obvious to anybody who's around someone who does. But in a nutshell, this is something that you get out of cuisine. Chefs talk about mise en place. And mise en place, if you really want to boil it down, let's say that it means putting things in their place, right? Mise en place. But it means a lot more than that. And I've actually done an article about this at one point that it got pretty popular for a little while, and it's something that I brought back up because this has been coming up a lot lately. People have been talking to me about preparation. I'm going to go ahead and throw that into the comments here. So if you're in the live comments, you're going to go ahead and see that link. And this is an article all about mise en place, all about essentially kind of sharing that sense with you of what is it to be prepared, what is it to have focus and to be present. And I know this will sound a little fluffy to some of you guys if I talk about presence and mindfulness and things like that, but think about it this way. It doesn't have to be about meditation. It can be about where is your head at? What are you thinking about? And where are your resources rather focused when you're working, whether it's art and digitizing, whether it's production for embroidery, whether it's business. How are we spending the limited amount of willpower and decision-making we have in a day? And trust me, science says we pretty much have a number of decisions we can make. So with that brief, kind of sting of going, okay, understand, we have a limited resource that is decision-making power. We have a limited resource that is our energy and our focus, and we definitely all know that we have a limited resource of time. How are we going to make the most of that? Part of that is through dealing with mise en place, dealing with preparation, focus, and presence. And in this case, the reason I kind of talk about mise en place is because I thought it was interesting, because though I'm not great at it. When you talk about my current space, the way I keep a desk is fairly messy. What I will say is when I'm doing my work, I tend to prepare for a task and I try and get things ready. And especially when we're talking about digitizing, when we're talking about embroidery itself, I get all of my supplies lined out. If you're someone who's watching, let's say like if you know Adam from Mythbusters, you'll see him. He's got a channel where he does a lot of builds, and he'll show you his build process. And he's a big fan of what's called knolling. And it's the same kind of thing where you take all of your parts and pieces, lay them out, and organize them before you start building something up. Whether it's a kit, whether it's something that you're building, whether it's a project, electronics, it's mechanical. You'll take all your parts and pieces, organize them, know where everything is before you get started. That's a form of this. Mise en place for chefs is more to the point where you're going to do all your prep work. You're going to cut all your vegetables. You're going to have all of your tools where they're supposed to be, and you're going to have a clean space where everything is at hand where it needs to be. It's a number of preparatory practices. It's not just one. So it's not just, as I say here, it's not just a French way to say be prepared. It's a little more than that. It's about having things prepped, measured, and at your fingertips where you need them. And the thing is, I think this applies to every part of the process of apparel decorating, every part of the process of business or creativity, doing anything you need to do. You can make this go better by prepping things and working in stages. And if you guys have checked in, I've talked about art preparation before. I've talked about workflow for embroidery before. Some of these things will be in the Takeup archives. If you go either YouTube channel or Facebook, go check that out and look into the archives. We did talk about some of this stuff. However, I'll try and give you some links to certain things that we're going to discuss through the course of the day today, talking about this kind of preparation. Like, here's one of the articles that I would like to talk about. And honestly, this is about business workflow. And I'll go ahead and throw this in. We'll get into that later. But we also have talking about art workflow. We're talking about embroidery workflow. And I've got this piece that I'll go ahead and share with you guys. And it's about drawing and digitizing and what that means. And that was over at Mr. X Stitch. And I'm going to go ahead and show you some other things. We have things about pathing, and we can talk about that. But in essence, we're talking about preparing and focusing. Dedicated preparation. Making sure you have what you need within reach when you need it is important. That foundational work is important. And the reason I want to discuss it today is because I've seen a lot of people discussing this when we're talking about digitizing. Quite frankly, in digitizing, you'll think, okay, how in digitizing is mise en place going to apply to me? And I'll say this, there are a lot of people who go into digitizing expecting that they're going to do artwork in their digitizing software. Now, lots of software, including Stitch Artist that you see me working in all the time, has awesome tools that do allow you to do some vector work or some rework on a design. But I will say, coming from kind of a more old school mentality, I would suppose, a lot of what we did back in the day, digitizing software was not bound or created or connected to art software directly. And I think we actually did gain something by not having that. It's that we did preparation. We didn't expect to do what we're seeing here. And in this case, this is someone doing a conversion direct from vector, where you grab a vector design that was made for print, dump it into your software, and then, in all honesty, you end up sometimes getting a pretty bad result because you're trying to use stuff for print. You have this logo here, and the lettering is punched out of the outside ring, and so we've got a gap instead of having letters on top. We've got pieces that are not meant for embroidery, because in print we can punch something out of a color and that's good enough, and we can run that, whereas quite often small text is going to be better stitched on top of a filled background rather than punched out. The thing is that prepped art, that art could be prepped for embroidery better, and I could still then reuse some of that vector art. So the thing is, I think it's really important to stop and do some artwork prep. Now, it doesn't always mean drawing all of your art for embroidery in art software before you start, but here are the things that I do think are fairly important to prepare when we're talking about artwork. I think it is important to know your scale. Absolutely, number one. I've had a million people talk to me about issues they're having with designs, and it comes out that they started at a different scale. They were working at a size that wasn't the finished size for the eventual piece. It is incredibly important to know the size of the piece. Are you going to make alterations to these things? Absolutely, but you're going to make different choices based on scale. If we go more than 20-odd%, especially when we have details and a lot of little pieces together that are either on the edge of being too large or too small, we've talked about this. You talk about resizing. I did a video recently about using stock designs where we talked about resizing and what changes stock design sizes and why you have to work with that. But I'm going to giggle. I have to stop and do this. Brian Bailey, Creative and Brilliance, comes up with a topic that I laughed because I saw it in the corner of my eye. When it comes to embroidery, size does matter. Yes, it does. Not that size didn't matter anywhere else, but hey, size absolutely matters in embroidery because scale matters. And working at scale matters, because when we're working at scale, if you develop an eye for digitizing, one of the things I always tell everybody is to work at a consistent scale, know what your scale is, turn your grid on in your digitizing system, and know what the scale of the squares and the lines behind that grid mean to you. Because the thing is, we know about the minimum size of a satin stitch it's going to run with 40 weight thread is around 1 millimeter wide, or 1 millimeter thick, if you want to say it that way, for a satin stitch column. If we know that, and we know what the scale is we're working at, we can make decisions as to whether a line is supposed to be or should be or technically can work as a satin stitch or a straight stitch or something else. But this requires working at scale. Well, what does that mean? We have to think about the position, placement, and how that design is supposed to look before we're done with the art phase. Before we ever get to digitizing, we should have a very good idea about what colors are going on with everything, because that may have to do with contrast, density, the way we handle underlay. A lot of things can be affected by colors of the garment and the design on top of it. Yes, we can do different colorways. We can work around that. But if we don't know that ahead of time, we may have issues. And especially if we're fully going to invert colors for something. Let's say we've got a solid white single color image that suddenly has to go on a white garment. We're going to invert it black. We may decide to outline it or add another piece to it instead of doing an inversion, so that we don't end up with weird negative colors that don't look like the original art. You can't always just flip a colorway. Sometimes you have to add something in the digitizing to make it look its best. We've all seen a single color version of face that's supposed to be shadows, and then it's flipped into a light color on a dark garment, and it looks weird because the shadows are brighter than the garment that they're on, and it looks funky. Instead, you could have drawn an outline around it, filled in that design, allowed the dark shadows to still be dark shadows, and had a slightly different version that was digitized specifically for the colorway. So color, size, those are important. The garment that it's going on, because honestly, if we don't understand the structure of the fabric that it's going on, we don't understand what we're doing. So those are the first parts. And that's all into the understanding of what the customer says. So part of this is in the customer interview. It is understanding what the customer is going to do. Or if we're doing this project for ourselves, it's in looking at the project and saying, this is the location where I want it. This is the garment that I'm using. This is the colorway that I'm looking at. This is the size that I want it to end up as. With those things in mind, we can do our work. If we don't prep that stuff ahead of time, we end up spending a tremendous amount of time reworking. And Jeff, of course, digitizing and embroidering himself, understands this. He says, wait, we aren't supposed to determine that stuff after the fact? LOL. You laugh, but I can't tell you how many times a new digitizer will come to me and say, I was working at something at 6 inches. It was 6 inches on screen. I was working on it that way. I put it in there. I figured I would work on it large and then shrink it down after I was done. The problem is that when we look at things like, so let's say a 3D preview on screen, the 3D previews are made with the intention for that size to be what they are. Plus, what they're doing is they're working on it larger than it is. Well, they can't see what actual stitches are going to be generating, because the stitches, of course, generate according to density. The thickness of that thread doesn't change when it's 6 inches or 2 inches. So what we end up with is more lines of thread. They couldn't do anything like fine shading. They can't tell exactly how things are going to work for compensation, because all of those things don't change with exactly with the scale of the design. So knowing the scale is important. And I'll also say this, truthfully, even though digitizing software is really much better these days at working with graphic software than it used to be, it's not graphic software. The things that we often need to do for redesigning work whole cloth are best done in graphic software. And honestly, there are, even if you are someone who's working in a hobby way and you're not really wanting to purchase a big professional graphic software package, that's fine. Honestly, there are lots of inexpensive packages right now. I frequently work in Affinity Designer and Affinity Photo, which are very cheap as far as those things go compared to working in like Photoshop or Illustrator. I also work in CorelDRAW, but I've worked in everything. That's just kind of how it is in the industry, especially when you're doing stuff for the industry. Why do we have all these different softwares? Sometimes because we have to take software input. We have to take working files from anybody's vector or software that they're using, so we have an access to open those things up generally. However, that's the thing, is that when we're working on that art, if you're going to go and redesign something whole cloth, it's often better to go ahead and do that ahead of time. And that's preparation. That's preparation work. And the other kind of preparation work you can do, and by the way, yeah, Mike, I agree with you. Inkscape is a great alternative. It's free. Yeah, Inkscape is a little harder to use than Affinity, I think, for some folks, but Inkscape is great. I used it for years and years until Affinity came out. And then Affinity was inexpensive enough and also does a good job of opening Illustrator files pretty well. I'm going to shake my hand on that one pretty well. So I'll agree with Jeff here, Affinity Club. Yeah, Affinity is pretty good. And if you're the kind of person who doesn't want to do a subscription service, Affinity is nice. However, the crux of this thing hasn't to do with that. The crux of this thing is preparation. And in this case, we're talking about, putting things in their place. Well, for digitizing, that means a couple things. Informational workflow. We've talked about this before, and we can talk about it again. We probably will do an episode about this again. Getting complete information from a customer and understanding, as we've talked about before, we make decisions based on the usage of the garment itself, then how it's supposed to be viewed, because it might change what size we want to use. Those things are the first part of it. The informational workflow is where we talk to the customer and find out what their problem is and solve it. I won't dwell on that too much while we're talking about digitizing art, but we don't know what decisions we need to make unless we know what problem we're solving, and that comes from completely understanding what the customer needs and what they want and working toward that with them. The next part is art preparation. And we're talking about art preparation. This is once we've made the initial round of decisions. The first round of decisions has been made. We know what the garment is. We know what the size is supposed to be. And now what we want to do is have nice, clean art that is going to work for us, that is at scale. So when we bring it into our software, we are ready to go. We don't have any more decisions to make. If we were going to change some text and move it, we've already moved it into its new location and sized it where it's going to be. If we were going to add a big border or outline to something, or we had to change something drastic in the coloring, we've done that changing. So what we're looking at in our software is what we eventually want to achieve. Are we going to make adjustments? Absolutely we are. Do we want to have to arrange things on the fly once we're digitizing? Probably not. Will you sometimes? Yes. But being prepared and having had that art done ahead of time, being ready for that is something that I think is worthwhile. And frankly, I often did vector redraws before I would work on something. And I don't know if I've got an example here. I probably don't have it here. Yeah, I did. I thought I had it in this article and I don't. I've often had pieces that I worked from embroidery, and I've talked about this in a previous video. We talked about working from a bad embroidered sample that's really not great flat art. And I think redrawing that into lovely flat art that allows us to see scales and shapes correctly means that we're not fighting both our perception of the poor art and the natural distortion we have to deal with for compensation and digitizing when we're working. And I'm going to take a couple of quick comments on this one too. Mike says, "Will come put me in the Corel Club." Yeah, that's why I don't always love integration, folks. Sometimes I just, I like Corel fine and I use it. I've actually used Corel for years. I used it before I used Illustrator. I went and converted to Illustrator and then came back. There's nothing wrong with Corel, but yeah, I don't also love going back and forth between the metaphors of graphics to embroidery. I don't think it works that well, and it introduces some things I don't love. So I'm not into that. I'm not into that at all. Sonia says structure equals function. Yeah, absolutely. And here's the other thing. When we're talking about digitizing, we know the shapes we need for embroidery are not the same as the shapes we need for print. They're just not. We know that we have overlaps we need. We know that we have, like I said earlier, pieces that shouldn't be punched out of a background. So using that, trying to directly use that vector for embroidery doesn't always work, even if it's nice and clean. And Jeff says, great thing from Jeff here, great time to measure line width before you pull it into digitizing software. Yeah, you can do that too. Now, lovely measuring software, measuring tools exist in software. I know you punch the M key in Stitch Artist and you're going to get a lovely little measuring line that will allow you to do that measurement. And that's fine too, but it's great if you want to grab that line width, especially working on vector. If it's a stroke, if it's a stroke line instead of an object, or if it needs to, you can then add a stroke to something and look at how thick a line is before you start reworking it. That's not a problem thing at all. And let's see here. Frank. Okay, I love this, Frank. And I'm going to go ahead and say the salty word that you took out here because, hey, we're on the internet. I can do that. Proper preparation prevents piss poor performance. I like that one, and it's hard to say out loud. Thank you, Frank. I agree that you win. I'm with Jeff. You win the internet. That is my favorite one. And Brian actually says, this is why I always prefer raster, JPEG, etc. And I'll actually say for my usage, I like to redraw my digitizing, and I'm kind of with Brian. I bring in fairly frequently a raster image. Here's the difference. I will draw something in vector so that I can bring in a clean, high resolution raster. And why is that? Well, because like Brian said earlier in the comments, well, if we can't make it bigger, we can zoom right in. And Brian knows very well because I bugged Brian until we got higher zoom rates in Stitch Artist because I like to zoom in real deep. And especially because I've got my grid set, if I know that this grid that originally looks like this is now this big, but I know it's still that same 1 millimeter, I don't have to worry too much about my zoom. I'll go ahead and take this off for a second. I know I'm leaving that up and leaving the articles in front of you guys, but I do think it's important to think about this stuff when we're talking about art. And here's part of the problem that people have. Like I said earlier, people think that they're going to be less creative somehow if they do a lot of this prep work or they make a lot of decisions ahead of time. But what I find is that both preparation and restriction, and I know this sounds crazy, making decisions so that you're not having all the options in the world, stopping and going, okay, I'm going to take this path. Because you can absolutely change your mind at any time. But if you're trying to go off in 50 different directions while you're trying to do something, especially when we're talking about interpreting art into embroidery, if we haven't decided what kind of method we're going to use, what kind of textures we're looking for, what sequence things are in to a degree, I mean, don't get me wrong, you develop a better kind of eye for things, and eventually your hand, your process, your recipes as a digitizer will become second nature to you, and things like sequencing will just happen. But when you're starting or when you're having trouble with a design, stopping to think about the sequencing before you digitize stops you from drawing and making things you don't need, and stops you from redoing work repeatedly. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and bring in one more comment from Brian here. Just don't super zoom when entering points. You'll add more detail than needed. Yeah, no, absolutely. Part of this whole calculus about zooming in and understanding what sizes things are and having your grid visible and showing what scale things are is about knowing how much detail to leave out. And that's part of the preparation process. And the other thing I like to show, and I'm actually going to go ahead and bring this back up on screen just to show you this stuff. This is one of the things that I have done and people don't always understand or figure out, is that, yeah, sometimes I will go to the point of drawing or sketching or coloring on a physical copy of a design. Now, it's been a long time since I've had to do this. And in fact, when I did this particular little picture for everybody, I actually staged this. This is a design that I did myself for Black Duck, and I showed how it would look if you were breaking it down and if you were trying to color this design. I am not suggesting you're going to take everything and do this. What I am suggesting is, if you're having trouble deciding how a piece of a design should work and you're not sure where it is, there's nothing wrong with stopping and doing some preparatory examples like this and saying, okay, I'm not sure how this is going to work. I'm going to stop and do some thumbnail sketching. Nobody's ever going to see it. It's not the embroidery. And as we know, guys, our file isn't the end product. Nothing is the end product but the embroidery. So everything we do up until that point is there for us. We can noodle, play with, discuss, kind of draw around. This drawing is not art drawing. This is us working things out. This is thinking on paper. This is thinking on screen. Sometimes drawing objects, and even in your digitizing software, drawing objects that you're never intending to use is fine, especially if you're doing it at one stage. Because if you look at this, if I've decided how to work on this little ornamental piece that's on the bottom of this text, and it made me kind of understand how I'm going to layer, the kind of effects I want, what am I going to do every time I encounter one of these little points that's on the edge of the design? Am I going to render that as a separate piece? Am I going to overlap stuff? Where are my over and unders? Where are the elements going to be? Am I going to turn through the corners in a certain way? Figure that out. And then that kind of visual language becomes what you use through the rest of the design. And then everything looks consistent and it looks clean. And that's something, especially if you're doing lettering, you're doing fonts. We've talked about this before, and it's something I'm sure I will revisit again. Make sure all your corners on your M's, your overlaps, your vertices look the same from the M to the N. How the K is handled, how the R and the P are handled, the R, the P, and the B, how the bowls attached to the back spine should be uniform if you're doing a piece of text. Knowing what that is and figuring out that visual language and that preparation is part of this. But that's where we are in the artistic side of this. Needless to say, for me, putting things in their place in this case means when I'm preparing art for embroidery, if I have to make new text, I'm going to have found my font. I'm going to have made the text in my vector software. I'm going to have it all set up in the art before I digitize. I'm not going to do it in the software. So if I'm adding new text to something, the likelihood is I'm not going to grab the True Types tool and drop it in on top of the thing and then digitize it. I'm probably going to do it in the art first so I can see what it looks like, make sure the color's right, place it, position it, and then I'm going to bring in the art whole cloth. It's not that we can't use the other way, and you certainly can, but for me, I'm going to do my layout work, my design part of the work in the art before I get to the digitizing. Like I said, not something you don't have to do. And certainly if you're using keyboard fonts, or if you're dropping something in and it's just a very simple, doing a text drop underneath something, fine. If you're really doing design work that fundamentally changes the design, I would say do the artwork first. Certainly, we're going to have all of our information about the use of the garment and how it's going to be, the colors of the garment, the fabric that it is, so we know what our underlay is supposed to be like. We know what kind of densities we're working with. Those things are all going to be in front of me. I'm going to know all the information about the job, how it's being done and produced, what materials are being used, what size it's going to be at, and have a clean copy, as clean as I can get it, for the art. Now, the thing is, if I showed you guys that don't panic piece earlier, I took a screen cap from a YouTube video from an old BBC television show. I didn't bother redrawing it because it was really simple art. It's not that you're going to do this for everything, but for projects where you're trying to nut something out, you're trying to work out something that's difficult, you're trying to work out an artistic style, working on the art first is a great way to do it. And I think that preparation is important. And also, this comes to some other topics, right? Briefly, and this goes with everything else, but this also goes to training. The more you do training for yourself, the more you understand the basics at the atomic level. Like I'm always saying, understanding the essence of the stitch means that when we go to digitize, we already have an understanding of how stitches work. We know pull compensation, push compensation, how underlay works. The more you know that stuff, the more free you are to focus on textural interpretation, kind of the sculptural look of embroidery, messing around with colors and blending. That stuff is all places where you can use that limited brain power, if you want to put it that way, that limited amount of decision making we have in a day. Well, we can focus it there if we've done our training ahead of time, if we personally have a foundation, if everything is put in place as far as ourselves, as far as our skill set and the practice that we do, that allows us to noodle in a more productive way. It allows us to improvise in a more productive way if we've done the training, if we have our tools in place, if we have our art set up, if we've made some decisions ahead of time. And the great thing you can do is do some of this prep work and this noodling before you go to actually digitize. Have things in place. So mise en place in this case, putting these in their place for digitizing really to me means informational workflow, knowing what you need to know, and art preparation, having your art prepped and ready before you start. Now, like I said, it's not the end of the world. You can do artwork in digitizing, and I will say there are certain circumstances, especially when we're talking about things like naturalistic renderings of animals, of organic textures, stuff like that. There are certain things that only make sense to work in the thread because the unit that I'm working with, the thing that I need to work with are stitches. I don't need to have big areas of vector art worked out. But when we're talking about things like logo types, when we're talking about things like corporate branding, then it makes absolute sense to get that art prepped ahead of time. It just makes sense. And that's really what I'm saying here. But Mike says, and I'm assuming a project you've done, which I'd love you to share, combing a movie frame by frame to replicate 16 patches with painful. Oh, that's right. If you guys haven't seen Mike Muldowney, he did a really cool costume for Halloween. And the character he had a jacket full of patches, and he went through all of that to get going through frame by frame so you could replicate the art from the patches. I bet you had to do some preparation yourself to get that art right before you started. You can't just digitize right on top of the patch. You'd end up with crooked, weird art. However, like I said, I've shown you guys some stuff I did. If you look back at one of the videos we did about patches, I showed you guys a piece that was essentially a wildlife scene with cranes touching down that I did for Bosque del Apache Wildlife Reserve. On that, I drew directly on the photograph. But here's the thing. I made that decision ahead of time. What did I already do? I laid out the patch. I knew where the photograph was going to land inside of the framework of the patch, so my layout work was done. But then the interpretation from the photo was done in embroidery directly, in stitches directly. I essentially painted with thread directly over the photo because at that point, there was no artwork I thought I could do that didn't have to be done in stitches. It absolutely needed to be stitches at that point. But the thing was, at that point, I had done all the prep work I could do, and the right tool for the job that I needed at that time was to digitize. And that is okay. Drawing in stitches when we are working with the stitch, with the texture of the stitch as a thing, especially talking about small line work and shading, or if we're reproducing a photograph, we're working from something that we're trying to take a photographic rendering and deal with the colors and the shading in embroidery. You can do art prep on some of that, but there will be times where you're working on something natural, and the most natural element, the finest element you're working with is the stitch. Like I said, animal work, fur work, feathers. I have frequently worked from the photograph directly because it makes more sense for me to have all the visual information from the photograph and work directly in the thread for that interpretation. But when we're talking about logo work, that's where you want clean lines, everything to be straight, everything to be the proper shape, size, orientation. And like Mike says, working from those movie frames, stretch, skew, contrast, sharpen, LOL, every trick in the book. And if you're somebody who's done a lot of commercial digitizing, you know that we've done all of the very same things working from poor art to try and get a resolution or to try and get colors that work or contrast where we can see enough of the lines to make our decisions. The thing is, it's not that you're going to take away your decision making. It's that the preparation you do will make less decision making to do at the last minute, which means you don't flounder and you get into that state of flow where the work just carries on, where all you're doing is the interpretation into embroidery. All you're doing is digitizing and not the remainder of messing about with the, like I said, with the layout, with other design methods, things that you don't really need to be working on at the time. And I think that's just what makes the most sense to me. But in any case, so working from that, let's go ahead and go into some other kind of options. Like I said before, I like to talk about other things. We had this other article that I put up before about getting down to improve your business. And so I will talk a little bit about business, a little bit about other things we can talk about with Mise en Place. And the first thing that I think is the most simple to kind of discuss, right? We talked about that, Mise en Place, putting things in their place. Well, let's talk about physical workflow for a second. This is something that's pretty simple to discuss, but I think it makes sense to bring it back up. This is one of the things I've had come up a lot this week. People have been asking me questions about layout in their shops. And layout in your shop, and here's the thing, it's a lot like pathing, right? We're talking about pathing with embroidery. What is pathing? Pathing is making the apparent motion of the needle be the most efficient that it can be and have the least jumps and trims that you can so that you reduce the amount of travel, right? You want the travel to always be going in a sensible way. Certainly we can talk about like hats or anything else where we have to get work from the center out so that we add stability, but to the best of our ability, where we are not hampered by things like physical nature of our garment that requires us to work in a different sequence, the best kind of pathing is where we work from one element to the other logically with the least amount of movement and excess, because that's what makes for good production. That's what makes for the easiest production, the least amount of trims, the least amount of downtime when we're embroidering, right? Well, physical workflow is a very similar thing, and mise en place is part of that. The thing is, this article is actually about improving your business when you need to get into, dealing with crunch time, when you're not in crunch time anymore, when you're dealing with time that you have free, when you're in a lull, then downtime is very well spent doing some of the kind of mental work that goes into doing this mise en place, right? And certainly when we talk about analyzing workflow, we've talked about informational workflow, but this is the other part of it, physical workflow. And admittedly, these like workstations that you're looking at here look a little rough. They're home built, but this is from a shop that I worked at. And obviously you can see we've got some older machines there. It's not like the beautiful ZSK multi-heads that are in my background all the time. These are some older machines that are there. However, even with home-built work tables made out of countertops and 2x4s and older machines sitting there, it's very efficient because it has everything where it needs to be around the person at the station where they need it so that it's at hand when it's time to use it. And that's really about part of the mise en place attitude. It's that if we do all the prep work, when you talk about mise en place, they're saying we're going ahead and measure everything. Everything's in little prep bowls. Everything's ready to go. We have all of our ingredients where we need them. We know where everything is. Everything is clean so we can work clean. And we absolutely have everything at hand, at our fingertips. This is the same thing we should look at for physical workflow. When we're talking about our embroidery machines, what does this mean? All the tools you need to do basic maintenance on your machine. And by the way, regular maintenance is part of this. Cleaning and regular maintenance is part of this so that your machine is always in the condition it needs to be when it's time to run. However, all the tools we need for regular operation and maintenance should be within arm's reach of the control panel. Like you shouldn't really have to go wandering around for tools. And this means that if you have multiple machines, you have to run around in a larger shop. I think that you should have a set of tools and let's say lubrication and the other stuff. You should have a set for every place you need it if it's stuff that has to be done during the work shift, during work time. And what does that mean? That we have all of the hoops that you need are at hand. All of these stabilizers are ready and prepped. And I would say that depending on how your workflow is or what kind of production you're doing, I like to use pre-cuts for a lot of stuff, especially doing a ton of left chests. Well, then having your basic kind of less chest frame in pre-cut materials just makes sense. For craft work, I probably wouldn't do that. What I would do for craft work, however, is make sure that I'm never hunting for materials when it's time to embroider. This may mean that I do a little hunting before it's time to embroider because that's part of the preparation. You stop and do that first. However, all the materials I need for a project I want to lay out and have at hand before I start working. And frankly, I think it makes sense to set up your space for some of this to be permanent. And I actually love this. Mike is going to come save me with a comment here. I like that somebody else is. I'm not the only crazy person who wants everything in hand. There's 4 sets of scissors, snips, tweezers, flashlights, and a few other things on each of my 12 heads. Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the worst things I have ever seen with physical workflow is I have been in a shop where someone was walking around looking for the screwdriver, and I'm not lying. This is in a place that had we were talking about 4 12-head machines that are spread across, frankly, 2 areas, and they probably should have been in one kind of area at a shop. And they had 1 screwdriver for changing needles. Let me let that sink in for a minute with a moment of silence for the poor person who was running around looking for that. There is no reason whatsoever that that should be a hunt. By the time you're hunting for anything in the process of doing production, you are losing profitability, you're losing runtime, and you're going to just drive yourself crazy and wear yourself out. You shouldn't be making the kind of decisions where it's like, do I keep running? Do I have to step away? Do I run out to get a screwdriver? Where is the screwdriver? Where are my snips? Where are my, like he says, tweezers and flashlights? All the things you need to do production should be at hand and prepped. They also should make sense. It can't just be that they're all in a jumble in a box somewhere really close to the machine. They should be kept in a way that pretty much if you blindfolded yourself and you're standing at your control panel, you should be able to reach your hand out and you know where those things are and they have a place and they go back to their place. And the other part of mise en place when you're talking about cooking is working clean. And what I mean by working clean is as you work, you clean up as you work. So pretty much when you're finishing up a task, that task is cleared away and everything is put away where it goes and it's literally clean. The surfaces are clean. Now with food, we know how important that is. The thing is, I will second that and say it's important in embroidery too. Why? If we have lubrication out sitting somewhere where we've just done our needle bars, we've done our hook race for this 4 hours, and we've got that sitting somewhere that's out where a garment can come in contact with it. We all know the heartbreak of having oil or something on a garment or having, say, spray tack somewhere where it doesn't belong. Spray adhesives should not be placed where something doesn't belong. Also, we shouldn't be working dirty in the fact that we shouldn't be spraying spray adhesives somewhere near a machine where it's all aerosolized right around where our thread paths are. We should get to an area that makes sense to do that prep work and do that prep work away from the machine far enough that we're not spraying stuff into our actual machine. We should do some of this stuff and work clean. So as far as physical workflow goes, here are some of the tips that I think are important. Number 1, have things at hand in place where you could blindfolded reach out for the thing you need and you know where it is and it's not a question. That shouldn't be part of the decision-making process. Hunting shouldn't be part of the work you have to do to get something done. Part of the other thing with physical workflow, we should think about not just the workflow of the machine, but the workflow of the entire area. If we're doing production, if this is in a commercial setting where we have mass production, I am a big fan of physical production queues, meaning that we can literally lay out garments and orders in a row of boxes that are, let's say, in order as far as the production day. I'm pretty big on having those physical orders there and doing that prep at the beginning of a shift when possible, if possible, so that when it's time to choose another order, we don't necessarily have to go to the system. We go to our informational system, our big board, whatever, stop and look at that. Then we go to 5 different places and hunt down all the things we need. If you don't have somebody who's managing production, then it can be the operator who's working on it. Or if you're a solopreneur, it can be you prepping things up. But I have been a huge fan in my career of having the items that need to be embroidered with a informational sheet on top that's got my colorways and my design prep and my last sample or whatever I'm using to verify the design. And if we're, depending on how we're doing designs, you can be fetching them off a server, you can be sending them directly, you can be using a thumb drive. The other thing I'll say is when I had a shop with multiple machines going on, we were using what we call sneaker net, which is delivering files by hand on thumb drives or on other media. Each job actually had its own media with it so that when it was time to load designs, you loaded designs directly and they were attached to it. We just had a ton of little drives and one went in the job jacket with the garments now, or with the informational sheets. Now, that's not really the best thing. That's not the most modern way. We're usually fetching things off a network these days or sending things to the machines ahead of time. What I will say is having your information laid out. If you have a printed copy that you're using for positioning, which often people do, then I would have that sitting there and I would be in order of production in my production queue physically the best I can. The other tip to go through, and it's something that's in this article, is that you should walk a job or multiple jobs physically through the shop and see how much walking you do. And I know it seems ridiculous, but very much like coloring a design for pathing, you should be looking at how many steps it takes to get a job done. Do I have 5 people at different machines walking back and forth to a printer because they're printing off information as needed when things come by because they need, like I said, a sheet for positioning or placement that they're testing out? Or are they walking back and forth to one cabinet where they have something stored that could be everywhere? Or could I network my machines and have them have the ability to pull files so that we don't have everybody walking back and forth to some sort of file server or sending designs as they go? Could I prep this in some other way? Could I save the designs ahead of time on the machine before it's time to do production? Look at how many steps there are. And sometimes you'll find there's stupid things you don't expect. Like there's some supply, some tool that is in short supply in your shop, or everyone has a favorite scissor and they all steal it and keep the same one. It is well worth the cost of everyone having one version of said scissor so they don't go looking for the good scissors in the shop every time it's time to do the job they need to, every time they're trimming out some stabilizer. The truth of the matter is, if we look at the lifetime of a shop, having the tools you need for each station means there's a ton of less walking, hunting, looking around, and making sure those tools are all in good operating order and in the place they belong is absolutely worth what you'll save in overall production time. So physical workflow is also big time where mise en place makes sense. So part of this stage is saying organize, clean, maintain, and repair. This is part of it. Make sure everything is in good repair in between the times that you're doing production so that when it comes time for that, that is not what you're having problems with. And the funny thing is I actually have talked about this when we're talking about machine acquisition. When people are saying they're going to buy their first machine and they want to buy the cheapest used machine they can because they're looking to have a lot of capacity. They're trying to get a big commercial machine, but they don't want to actually, they can't really pay for that machine at the time. There are times where if you're brand new to embroidery or brand new to digitizing and you decide to buy a machine that's maybe not in the best repair, or you're not keeping your machine in good repair, you'll find that you're doing things in your artwork that you're forced to do in order to make things work correctly on that machine. And that's something that may actually teach you improperly how to do the work. So where and when it's possible, I've worked on a lot of old machines. And frankly, I started on really bad machines. If you hear me discuss my story of how I came into the embroidery world, I started with really old, really poor machines, right? And the really old, really poor machines that we started from, they didn't have thread break sensors. They didn't run all that well. And frankly, from one machine to the other, they didn't exactly operate correctly. And when I became a digitizer, part of the thing I would sometimes do is we would have a specific file that was for machine 3. Why? Machine 3's pantograph, for some reason, is a little weird in the x-axis. And if I put a little extra comp on that sucker in the x-axis, or I stretch the design a little bit, then it starts to match machine 2 and machine 4. You really shouldn't do that unless you're absolutely forced to by circumstances. Keep your machine in good repair, and then you don't fight the machine or fight the supplies or fight some other part of the process when you're trying to do things like, I don't know, learn digitizing or get a design working, and you're trying to work on art interpretation, but you're fighting thread breaks because your machine has some sort of nick in the needle plate or something's wrong in the thread path. Also, if your thread path gets entirely dirty and gunky and horrible, well, we all know it's going to mess with your tensions. And suddenly now things like pull compensation might change a little bit because you're actually fighting problems with tension. You're actually fighting problems with a filthy thread path. So clean, maintain, organize, repair. These are things that are important. And by the way, do as I say, not as I do. I'm not saying I'm always perfect at it. Very few of us are going to be perfect at it. What I'm going to say is the more time we spend on this, or the more we are conscious of this, the less likely we are to have these problems and become frustrated when we're actually trying to execute. And I'll say this is definitely something for me where I have been the kind of person who wants to run to a machine and throw something on there because I'm doing something, I'm into a creative process and I want to test something out. And I have been paid back poorly many times for not stopping to go, okay, let me go get all my materials right. Let me have everything at hand. And has this machine that I'm about to use, especially when you have a sampling machine that you're not turning on all the time, is it currently lubricated correctly? Is the thread path clean? Is everything where it should be? Have I tested it? Have I worked it out? Are the tensions right? Is everything good? Well, you need to organize, clean, and maintain, and repair. And the other thing is, truthfully, the worst thing is when you're trying to figure something out, or you're doing what we always say, right, firefighting. You have a problem that you're trying to deal with. You're firing up a machine that you don't use all the time because you have extra capacity. You got to get something done. Like I said, firefighting. you're doing the things that come up when you're working in a business, there is no more likelihood of tragedy, of mistakes, than when you don't have your area right. You're working in a place where the pantograph can't move freely on your machine because there's junk everywhere. You accidentally tuck something under the hoop and sew it through. These kind of things don't happen when you stop to work clean, get your area prepped, lay everything out. And often it's 5 minutes. It's 5 minutes you can spare to stop and make sure you have everything you need where it needs to be. All right. So once again, what do we have again? Mise en place, putting things in their place. And how did that work with physical workflow? Well, it means that with physical workflow, every tool we need is close at hand. We know where it is. We're working clean so we don't foul garments with materials, with oils or anything that shouldn't be near them. We don't accidentally set something down in a dusty pile and find out that our white garment can't come clean, and we certainly can't wash it before we deliver it to the customer. These kinds of things are prevented by working clean. And we prevent the loss of time. We also think about our cues and how literally does a garment move through our shop? Is someone going to have to navigate all over the place, trip all over a bunch of exposed cords, go back and forth constantly to look for tools that are missing? We don't want that. So literally walk a job physically through the process of all the things it takes to do and look for wasted movement, look for wasted hunting for things that you might need, and consider how you can queue up your work so that you have everything in order before you start. That way, when it's time to embroider, the only things you're worried about are the embroidery, the production, watching how things work, hooping things correctly, making sure that everything's running the way it should be, and moving things through the process to finishing. That's all we're looking for. So in physical production, that's what we're looking for. And this applies to everything from the way we lay our shop out to the kind of staff we put on different tasks. And like I said, if you're working by yourself, you might think this is not necessary, that it's something you don't need to think about. But like I said, if you want to save yourself from floundering at the machine, searching for stuff, for being frustrated, for dropping tools all over the place, for like I said, fouling a garment by putting it on top of, underneath something that is dirty or oily, stopping to have these things prepped means there's no dropping tools everywhere, no knocking things off the table, no having your pantograph run into stuff, no fouling garments, because you know where everything goes, everything's ready before you start. And like I said, 5 to 15 minutes will often make a huge difference to an entire production day. So there's mise en place as far as that goes. And one of the last things I want to talk about a little bit were business, right? We're talking about business. What is mise en place in business? Now, certainly we talked about what we do with art, prepping and punching, talk about pathing. We talk about art files, right? We have that in an earlier session of the Takeup, but you haven't talked about that. So that's all stuff that we can do. We've talked about informational work. So we talk about informational workflow. What does it have to do with business, right? What does it have to do with business that we talk about mise en place? Well, in my case, I'll say there's a few things I think are preparatory work for business that are important. One of the things is, like I said, we talk about informational workflow. That goes for multiple things. It goes for not only working with customers, it goes for any project we're going to do. Having our research in order and knowing about what we're going to do before we do it. It doesn't mean that we don't encounter new items. It doesn't mean we don't encounter new things that are going to be difficult for us. What it does mean, however, is that if we have things in place, if we have solutions in place in case there's something wrong, like I said, firefighting, it's a lot easier to do when you've already picked up a fire extinguisher. You can't fight a fire without the tools to fight a fire. And part of that, I would say, is training. So each one of us, you guys are already here today. So what do I know? I know you want to learn. So if you're the kind of person who wants to learn, go ahead and get your training in right now, in this moment. Because of what's going on in the world, yes, it means business is as difficult as it's been for a lot of people, but it also means that the kind of training resources that have only been available siloed at the coasts or at certain parts of the country with trade shows are now being made available to everyone online in a way they never have been before. So if you have time and when you have time, and I'd say honestly, make time to train. It's not that you should know how to do everything yourself, but knowing at least what things are necessary for different tasks, whether it's in business, whether it's in digitizing embroidery, whether it's in finishing, packaging, marketing, social media, whatever it is that you're trying to achieve in your business, it's always worthwhile to do some training and do some research. And that kind of training is preparing yourself like a tool set and knowing where you're going to have those resources. And what you may understand is that you aren't going to do all these things, and that your company maybe won't do all the things in the world. I've often talked about niche marketing. The first thing I'm going to say is, when I talk about niche marketing, I don't mean get into one niche and only be in that niche. In the current climate, that's been pretty hard for a lot of people. If you were doing team sports only and you're a shop, you probably had a really rough few months. So I don't mean when you're prepping and doing a niche, you should prep for that. What I mean is learn your niche, know that niche, and have that information so that you can penetrate that niche and be a real participant in that space, but be aware of the capabilities you have and what other markets are around that you could service, so that when the day comes that you need to change new markets or have a more diversified portfolio of jobs coming in, and I think you should be doing it anyway. The shops that I've been in that closed, frankly, they usually have put too many of their eggs in one basket. They end up getting 3 or 4 big keystone clients, and you lose 2 in the space of a year because something goes wrong, or your keystone clients, because they already trust you because of your niche, are all in one business segment, and then something bad happens to that business segment and your keystones drop away. Part of preparation and training is you have to learn about what's around you. You have to be aware of your situation so that when it's time to reach out for new business, you can. And part of that is networking. Make sure to keep getting out there, talking to people, understanding what's available, and knowing through understanding your own capabilities, your shop's capabilities, what you can do with your machines, what you can do creatively, what you can do functionally. Knowing where you can go for new business, knowing what you can address, what problems you can solve. And if you're not doing that, if you're not doing the actual work you need yourself, knowing who can so you can partner with them and provide comprehensive solutions. What I usually call that is building your dream team. And when I was working in commercial embroidery, a lot of that had to do with capacity. We had a middle to large capacity. We were great for middle range orders. We were not perfect for small one-off orders. Did we do some? Yes. Was it our bread and butter? No. We were set up for larger orders. Also, we did not do titanic orders like you would do necessarily overseas that were thousands upon thousands of items with one decoration. We were in the middle. So for us, it made sense to know that. Also, if we didn't have all the equipment for particular kinds of decoration, like let's say embossing, let's say a chenille, something that we did not do ourselves, we had a team of people who we trusted, a team of companies we could outsource to that were valuable to us and we had good relationships with, so that when it came time to do that kind of job, we could reach out. They were at hand virtually to help us with that work. Now, I've got some comments here, so I'm going to go ahead and jump in over as well. So let's see. Let's have a couple of things that we jump in with this. We're talking about having tools at hand, and I like to do comments, so I'm going to bring a few comments in really quickly. Brian says, it's not just the tools. I have a pair of reading glasses at all my work areas. Yeah, if you need reading glasses, have them where you need them. Absolutely. And I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Plus, don't be afraid to use them if you need them. If you need magnification, have that magnification at your station. Do it. Oh, and Jeff, thank you for this. Shameless plug, but this is one of my classes that I actually did. I have a class that's available online right now, Demystifying Digitizing, and Jeff says that was definitely worth the cost of admission. And yeah, and I would not have done the Demystifying Digitizing class. I stumbled over my own complicated title. I would not have done that class online. It's a 4-hour course that I wouldn't have prepared online if it weren't for what's going on right now. And that's happening all over. Just this morning on the Two Regular Guys, we had the folks from NBM out. We had Dave Pomeroy, president of NBM, National Business Media. They make the Graphics Pro magazine, which I have been in previously. I'm going to be back in, coming in soon. And the Graphics Pro magazine, that stuff, they are taking their NBM shows online, and they're having this thing called Garment Decorating Day. And a lot of my friends are going to be there teaching, and that stuff is free right now. We're getting the kinds of classes that you would have had at trade shows either for free or for a cost that is very reasonable considering what they're offering. And it's really cool that way. And Letty says, love that you guys are doing these multiple media blasts of knowledge. Makes me a grateful reciprocator. Ah, man, I love that. Letty, thank you for saying that. And honestly, we love doing this stuff. This is what we want to do. Absolutely. This is what we're trying to do. We are trying to bring people up. And what I'm going to say is this. There are times where I've had somebody say, aren't you afraid of giving this all away? What if somebody gets better than you and does your job for you? All of us are going to age out someday. We're not all going to do this forever. I plan to die at my desk digitizing the last day of my life, I'm sure. However, the truth of the matter is, if I don't bring someone else in beneath me who comes in from the ground level and starts doing something better than me, then I have lost out. Then the sum of human knowledge in my field up to this point has been lost. What else do you want? We got to share this stuff and bring it to everyone. And those of us who know that the legacy is to continue on this beautiful craft, this wonderful business as far as we can and into the future, and to prepare. That's the legacy, to prepare the next generation of people who are doing it, whatever age they are, frankly, to do what they want to do and express themselves and make some money when they can. And also MNerd is doing that too. Yes, I will agree with that. And Jeff and the folks at MNerd should really be happy about what they've been putting on. And Brian says, the glasses remind me I'm now a full-fledged MNerd, and thank you, Jeff. I don't have my glasses here, but if you haven't seen the cool kits that they made up at MNerd with glasses to relieve strain, that's another great thing if you're digitizing. Anti-glare glasses that relieve eye strain are great and a good way to prepare, and they made some really cool ones. You should go check those out, and thank you, Jeff, for those awesome packages as well. And let's see here. Scissors, Jamie says, scissors everywhere you need them because I hate looking for them. Absolutely. Having 3 pairs of them is worthwhile if they need to be at 3 different stations. You shouldn't be running to the finishing area to get scissors for your production area. It just doesn't have to be that way. And Michael says, talking about niches, that's the only way my business has stayed alive, being in several niches. Absolutely. There's nothing wrong with that. What I will say is this. When I talk about niche marketing, for me, niche marketing and working in a niche is the entryway for people who are not great at selling, or at least don't feel like they are. Number one, if you go see, I've talked about niche marketing. There's a previous episode of Takeup that will take you all through the way I've done it before. And I'm not going to recount what niches I've worked in. I'll say this, though. That knowledge of a niche allows you to address people and be coming to them as a member of their community. And because you understand what they need, it means that you are really well able to present value to them, and you know what they want, you know their taste, and it's very easy for you to speak their language. And because you do speak their language, it means they accept you quickly. Niches are great when you participate in them because it allows you to present to friends who are like-minded an object, an item, a service that you know they'd like. And what it does is it takes the used car salesman vibe out of selling. However, being in one niche in such a dedicated way that you can't do anything else means you are absolutely exposed to the tides of time and fate. And when something goes wrong in that niche, you may not have the basis that you need. So I think what it makes sense to do is to be excellent at your craft, to absolutely know a niche very well, and that can be your focus, your one thing that makes you very different, but you should be able to embroider, able to decorate whatever you need to. Like I said, I am not great at, let's say, making lace. Can I make some lace? I can make some lace. I want to learn it much better. That wasn't my focus. I did a lot of really cool work for movie props and patches and stuff like that. Did a lot of military and police for a while, but I can digitize a ton of stuff. I've also done fashion work. I've done home decor work because it wasn't that much different. Now, I know people who are excellent at home decor, and it's almost all they do. But I also know that if you grabbed them and said, can I get a logo for my decor company as well? Can you also embroider these shirts? Those people, despite the fact that they're set up to do decor work, I am certain they could take that corporate logo on and deal with it. And especially if it meant keeping their client happy or expanding their niche or saving their business. So I think that's certainly interesting. So, that's one of those things I think is worthwhile to say. Part of that preparation, like I said, mise en place, in this case, having things at hand. Well, for me, I'm going to extend that to say having solutions at hand, having your outsourced suppliers and partners at hand, knowing where your supplies come from, training yourself so you keep on top of your industry, on top of marketing, on top of the things that are surrounding you so that you don't fall out of the current stream. Those things are all part of mise en place too, to a degree. And what I mean by that is that we should take time out of our schedule to not just work in our business, but on our business. And in that case, it means you can't just grind production all the time. You need to stop and take time to develop yourself professionally, to develop yourself personally, and to creatively play. These things are all important because you can't keep going back to the well without letting it refill. You can't just keep pulling on the well of creativity, problem solving, decision making without pausing and letting it fill, and without doing things that feed that well. Part of the things that are going to feed that well: training, interacting with people who are in your industry, building relationships, and honestly, prospecting. Those are all things that feed the well. The well of sales is fed by prospecting, by thinking of new concepts for your business, new directions you can go. The well of creativity is fed by taking in things that are creatively inspiring, by taking in inspirational material, by viewing art, by looking at other kinds of embroidery, by listening to shows like this, I hope. And the well of skills that you can rely on, your skill set, that's filled by training, that's filled by going to trade show classes, that's filled by taking courses. Last week, I talked a little bit about lynda.com or LinkedIn Learning, so you can take some online courses in unrelated stuff. And by the way, some of the stuff you should learn should not be just the core. Consume broadly and create with focus. And that's how we get to do that cool creative work. So I think that's all what we're going for. So let's go ahead and tie this up, folks. I don't want to go deep into bonus time with this one. I think we can kind of leave it at that. Certainly, one of the things that this preparation can do for us is save us from what I call plate spinning. If you've never seen this before, plate spinning is like kind of an act that you would see people do on stage where they throw these plates on top of these little spikes and spin them and keep them all spinning, and they get several spinning all at the same time, and they're constantly having to add a little bit of inertia to all these different little plates. And one of the things that happens when you don't prepare is you end up having multiple little things that you have to focus on and keep adding energy to, multiple decisions you have to make, things you have to keep going back and revising. And it means that if you stop adding inertia or looking at all these little things, that one of them is going to drop. And the thing is, if you're doing things in stages and you're working clean and you're working to one task at a time, it means that you can maintain focus on that one task. And instead of plate spinning, you're doing one set of work. It's more like being a potter at the wheel. The thing is in front of you and working. Yes, it's moving. Yes, you're reacting to the things that are happening in front of you. But right now you are making a pot. You are not redesigning a pot. You are not deciding whether it's going to be a pot or a cup or a plate. You are already decided on what it is. You know what size about that it's going to be. You might make some changes while you go, but you're working on the task at hand. And when we have to make sure then that our wheel spins and we have the clay we need and we have the water at hand and the slip is ready and we can do all these things, and we're not putting it in the kiln yet. We're not selling it at the store yet. We're not glazing it yet. We're making the pot. And I think when we're dealing with things that are both creative and sometimes things that are not, you might not think of them as creative, but we're dealing with business. Sometimes it really can detract from our ability to stay in the moment and to bring bring to bear the fullness of our abilities on any one task if we are plate spinning, if we are running all over the place. And part of that is making sure that our area, if it's physical, our mind, if it's mental and creative, is already in a space that's prepped for the work we need to do, and that we don't let it get cluttered up while we work. So that's why I use the term mise en place. So think about that, guys. Put things in their place. Make sure you have things in the place they need to be so you can get to them when you need them. And like I said, work clean. Make sure that things are cleaned away and cleared away, and make room for the next task at hand. Make the decisions that you need to make before you start the work. Will you have to change things? You absolutely will. Will you have to react to things that need to be happening or that change that as they happen? Yes. But if we know that there's 80% of the things that we can plan for and maybe 20% that we can't, well, that 20% is going to keep being there. But if that 80% is taken care of, the 20% is less likely to overwhelm us. If we don't take care of the 80% of the stuff that we could have controlled, then if it's already 80% chaos, when the 20% that we're trying to control turns into chaos, when something happens that we can't control, then it's 100% chaos instead of being 80% under control and only 20% stuff that we have to deal with. So that's what I'm going to say, guys. Very happy to have you all here and in for this. I know it's not the most fun episode. Maybe we'll see about doing something more creative next time, a little bit more that's directly about embroidery. But I do think even the art prep portion of that was useful. And if you have questions about that stuff, definitely hit me up in the comments. Let's definitely discuss this. If you're watching this on the replay right now, if you're on YouTube or Facebook, absolutely make comments, because the people here and myself will still reply to these things. And also, if you have things you want to see on the Takeup coming up, please get in contact with me here. Check me out at ericcampbell.com. You can contact me there. And the things you ask me there may become the things we talk about next week. So with that, guys, I would love to thank you and recommend to you that you take this day that some people might think of as unlucky and realize that the propensity for change is something that can bring us the greatest wealth if we are prepared to take advantage of it when it comes around. So with that, guys, I'm going to leave you at last once again with a little message from from Douglas Adams and myself and say thank you for being here. And I can't wait until next week.